Nobody in the Galactic Union had ever bothered to study what humans put in their mouths. There had been no reason to. Humans were new to the galactic stage, a small species from a minor world, and the Union had more pressing matters than cataloging the dietary habits of yet another oxygen-breathing civilization. That changed the day a human cargo pilot walked into a Union refueling station on the edge of the Polari cluster and ordered something called a sandwich. Drallo had been sitting 3 tables away when it happened. He was a nutritional researcher for the Polari Science Collective, a quiet man by nature, with pale gray skin and 4 delicate fingers on each hand. The Polari were herbivores. They ate soft mosses, mineral pastes, and the occasional sweet nectar drawn from cultivated flowers. Eating, for Drallo's people, was a calm and silent act, almost meditative. The human sitting across the food court was doing something very different. She had taken 2 slabs of a baked grain product and placed between them a stack of ingredients that Drallo could not immediately identify. There was animal flesh, cooked until it had changed color. There were slices of a plant that smelled sharp enough to make his eyes water. There was a thick yellow substance that appeared to be some kind of aged and chemically altered animal secretion. And on top of all of it, she had squeezed a red paste that his scanner identified as containing capsaicin, a chemical compound that caused pain responses in most biological organisms. Then she bit into it. With force. Her jaw closed with enough pressure to make Drallo flinch. He could hear the crunch of the grain slabs from where he sat. The human chewed with visible satisfaction, and Drallo watched a small drop of the red paste fall onto her uniform. She wiped it away without concern and took another bite. Drallo had studied the eating habits of 47 species across the Union. He had never seen anything like this. He pulled up his datapad and began recording observations. Within an hour, he had filled 6 pages. The human ate 3 more items after the sandwich. One was a fruit with a hard outer shell that she cracked open with her bare hands. Another was a dark brown block that his scanner identified as a compound made from fermented and roasted plant seeds, mixed with animal fat and crystallized plant sugars. She ate this one slowly, with her eyes half closed, making small sounds of pleasure that Drallo found deeply unsettling. The third item was a cup of liquid so hot that steam rose from its surface. She drank it without waiting for it to cool. Drallo checked his scanner twice. The liquid was nearly 70 degrees. Any Polari who put that in their mouth would have suffered 3rd-degree burns to their entire oral cavity. The human finished her meal, stretched her arms above her head, and walked away as if nothing remarkable had happened. Drallo sat still for a long time after she left. Then he opened a new file on his datapad and typed a request to the Polari Science Collective. He asked for funding, a research partner, and clearance to conduct an extended study of human dietary behavior at a location with a large human population. He suggested Port Callaway, a human-operated trade station in the Mid-Rim territories. His request was approved within 2 days. The Science Collective had not been particularly interested in human food habits, but Drallo was a respected researcher and his requests were rarely denied. They assigned him a partner, an insectoid analyst, named Bivin from the Chelric species, who specialized in chemical compound identification. Bivin had 6 legs, compound eyes, and a metabolism that ran entirely on a liquid mixture of dissolved calcium and sugars. He had never seen solid food being consumed and was not sure he wanted to. The 2 of them boarded a transport vessel and made the 11-day journey to Port Callaway. The station was enormous by Mid-Rim standards, home to roughly 40,000 humans and a rotating population of alien traders and diplomats. It had markets, living quarters, cargo bays, and, at its center, a massive open area that the humans called the food court. Drallo and Bivin arrived with a cover story. They were registered as trade consultants conducting market research on cross-species commerce. It was a thin cover, but humans rarely questioned visitors who carried official union documentation. They were given temporary quarters and access to the station's public areas that on their first morning, they walked into the food court and stopped. The noise hit them first. Hundreds of humans gathered in one space, all of them eating, talking, laughing, and arguing at the same time. The smell hit them second. Drallo counted at least 30 distinct chemical signatures in the air, ranging from pleasant floral compounds to aggressive sulfur-based aromatics that made Bivens' antennae curl backward. The sight hit them third. Everywhere they looked, humans were putting things in their mouths. Hot things, cold things, things that were still moving, things that were on fire. Bivin turned to Drallo and said very quietly that he would like to go back to the ship. Drallo shook his head. He opened his datapad, found an empty table near the edge of the court where the air was slightly less overwhelming, and sat down. Bivin joined him reluctantly, his 6 legs tucked close to his body. They began to watch. And what they saw over the next several hours would change everything the Galactic Union believed about the small, loud, endlessly hungry species from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. Drallo did not know it yet, but he was about to become the most famous nutritional scientist in the history of the Union. And it would all start with a single question that he typed into his datapad that morning. Why do they eat like this? Bivin had developed a nervous habit of clicking his mandibles together whenever he was stressed. By the third day on Port Callaway, the clicking had become almost constant. It was not his fault. The things he had witnessed in the human food court would have shaken any Chelric. On their second morning, he had watched a human male take a piece of raw fish, wrap it in dried plant material and compressed grain, and eat it without cooking it at all. The fish had been dead for less than an hour. Bivin's compound eyes had tracked every movement of a human's jaw, and he had calculated the bite force at roughly 340 newtons. That was enough to crush the exoskeleton of a juvenile Chelric. He had included this observation in his notes and then gone to the restroom to sit quietly for 20 minutes. Drallo, on the other hand, was thriving. He had filled his datapad with hundreds of entries. He had cataloged over 90 distinct food items consumed by humans in the food court alone, and he had begun to notice patterns that disturbed him far more than the raw fish. Human food preparation was not random. It followed a structure, a logic, and that logic looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied predator behavior across the galaxy. First, there was the sourcing. Humans did not simply accept whatever nutrition was available. They searched for specific ingredients with the focus and patience of a hunting species. Drallo had watched a woman spend 45 minutes at a market stall, picking up fruits one by one, smelling them, squeezing them gently, and putting most of them back. She was selecting, evaluating. It was the same behavior that Drallo had observed in the Vorik, a 6-legged predator species from the Outer Rim, when they stalked prey through dense forests. Second, there was the preparation. Humans did not eat most of their food in its natural state. They transformed it. They applied heat, sometimes extreme heat. They submerged food in acids. They coated it in chemical compounds that altered its molecular structure. They used fermentation, a process in which they deliberately introduced bacteria to break down food over days, weeks, or even years. Drallo had found records of a human food called cheese that was sometimes aged for over a decade. The chemical complexity of the final product rivaled some pharmaceutical compounds. Third, there was the presentation. This was the part that confused Drallo the most. After all the hunting and chemical processing, humans arranged their food carefully on flat surfaces called plates. They organized it by color. They added small decorative elements that served no nutritional purpose. They took images of the food with their personal devices before eating it. Drallo had seen this behavior in only one other context in his entire career. The Grelith, a pack-hunting species known for their extreme aggression, displayed their kills in elaborate arrangements after a successful hunt as a show of dominance and skill. Humans were doing the same thing. With their lunch, Drallo compiled these observations into a behavioral framework and showed it to Bivin. The Chelric read it in silence, his antennae slowly flattening against his head. When he finished, he looked at Drallo and asked a simple question. Are we safe here? Drallo did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up one more observation from his notes. It was something he had witnessed that afternoon and had not yet fully processed that a human child, no more than 5 or 6 years old by human aging standards, had been sitting at a table near their observation point. The child's parent had placed a plate of food in front of her. On the plate were several small orange sticks that Drallo's scanner identified as a root vegetable called a carrot. The child had picked one up and bitten through it with a single clean snap. The sound had been sharp, like a branch breaking. Drallo had measured the density of the vegetable. It was fibrous, rigid, and required significant force to sever. A Paul-Urey adult could not have bitten through it without specialized tools. The child had eaten 7 of them, without effort, while humming a song. Drallo sent his preliminary report to the Galactic Union that evening. He classified it as urgent. The report was 12 pages long and contained detailed chemical analyses, behavioral comparisons, and jaw force measurements. But the section that would cause the most concern was a single paragraph near the end.I in it. Drallo wrote that human food behavior could not be classified as simple omnivorous feeding. The complexity of their sourcing, preparation, chemical modification, and social presentation patterns matched or exceeded the hunting behaviors of every known apex predator species in the Union's records. Humans did not merely eat. They conducted organized, multi-stage predatory operations against their food, using tools, chemistry, fire, biological warfare in the form of fermentation and social coordination. And they did it 3 times a day. Sometimes more. That he added one final note before submitting the report. It was an observation he had made while watching the food court during the evening meal period when the space was most crowded. The humans were not just eating near each other. They were eating together. They passed food between themselves. They offered bites to each other from their own plates. They argued about which preparation methods were superior, sometimes with a passion that bordered on genuine anger. One group of humans at a corner table had spent over 2 hours eating, talking, and laughing, and when they finally left, they embraced each other at the door. Drallo did not yet understand what this meant, but he noted it carefully because something about the way humans shared food felt important. It felt like it was connected to everything else, like it was the piece that would eventually explain all of it. He just did not know how yet. The council chamber on Station Adavar had not been this full in over 3 years. The last time so many species had gathered in one room was during the border dispute between the Chelric hive colonies and the Vorik hunting clans. That argument had nearly started a war. This one, somehow, felt worse. Drallo stood at the center of the chamber, his gray skin pale under the bright overhead lights. His datapad was in his hands, and his 4 fingers were trembling slightly. He had not expected this kind of reaction. He had submitted a research report, not a declaration of emergency. But the Union's Dietary Sciences Division had flagged his findings and escalated them to the full Galactic Council within 48 hours. Now he was standing in front of representatives from 72 species, and most of them looked afraid. The first to speak was Delegate Pulliner of the Gelvin. The Gelvin were tall, thin beings with translucent green skin and broad, leaf-like structures along their arms and shoulders. They drew their energy from light. The concept of consuming another living organism for nutrition was, to them, a kind of violence. Pulliner's voice was high and strained as she addressed the chamber. She said that the report confirmed what many species had quietly feared since humanity's admission to the Union. Humans were not a cooperative species. They were predators wearing the mask of diplomacy. Their food habits revealed their true nature. Any species that could do what Drallo had described to its own food supply would eventually do the same to its neighbors. Several delegates signaled agreement. The noise in the chamber rose. Next was Delegate Moron of the Relevi. The Relevi were soft-bodied, slow-moving creatures who consumed predigested nutrient slurries through absorption membranes. They had no teeth, no jaws, and no concept of chewing. Moron spoke calmly but firmly. He proposed that humans be reclassified from cooperative species to apex predator under Union taxonomy. This reclassification would trigger automatic restrictions on human trade, travel, and military capacity. It would effectively reduce humanity to a monitored species, watched and contained like the Vorik had been centuries ago. The chamber buzzed with discussion. Several smaller delegations, species that had already felt uneasy around humans, began signaling support for Morin's proposal. A motion was formally raised and seconded. Drallo watched all of this from the center of the room and felt a growing knot in his stomach. This was not what he had intended. His report had been a scientific document. Data, observations. He had not written it as a warning. He had written it because the data was genuinely remarkable. Human food behavior was unlike anything in the Union's records. That did not automatically make it dangerous. But before he could speak, another voice rose from the upper tier of the chamber. It belonged to Asura, a Mevali diplomat who had served on the council for over 30 years. The Mevali were amphibians, small and round, with wet, dark skin and large golden eyes. They were not a powerful species. They held no major territories and controlled no significant trade routes. But they were old members of the Union, and their voices carried weight because they rarely used them. Asura had lived among humans. She had spent 4 years on Earth as part of a cultural exchange program, one of only a handful of aliens who had ever done so. When she spoke, the chamber quieted. She said that the council was making a mistake. Not a small one, a dangerous one. She said she had read Drallo's report carefully, and it was excellent work. The observations were accurate. The data was sound. But the conclusion that the council was drawing from it was wrong, because the council had asked the wrong question. The council was asking what humans eat. The correct question, Asura said, was why. She turned to Drallo directly. She asked him if, during his time on Port Callaway, he had ever sat down and eaten a meal with a human, not observed from a distance, not scanned their food with instruments, but actually sat at their table and shared their food. Drallo admitted that he had not. Asura nodded slowly. She said that was the problem. She said that human food could not be understood through scanners and chemical analyses alone. It had to be experienced. The data was only half the story. The other half was something that could not be measured, and it was the half that mattered most. She proposed that the vote on reclassification be delayed. She asked the council to give Drallo 60 more days to continue his research with one condition. He had to go back to Port Callaway and actually eat with the humans. Not watch them, not study them from across a room. He had to sit at their tables, accept their food, and try to understand what it meant to them. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Delegate Pulliner asked why they should risk 60 more days when the evidence was already clear. Asura looked at her with those large golden eyes and said something that Drallo would remember for the rest of his life. She said that in her 4 years on Earth, she had learned that humans express their deepest emotions not through words, not through gestures, but through food. When a human feeds you, Asura said, they're telling you something that they cannot say any other way. And if this council votes to condemn humanity without understanding that, then the Union will have made an enemy of the most loyal friend it could ever have. The vote on the delay passed by a narrow margin. Drallo was given his 60 days. He left the chamber with his leg shaking and Asura's words still echoing in his mind. The freight hauler crew of the ship called Dustrunner did not look like the kind of people who would change the course of galactic politics. There were 6 of them, all tired, all loud, and all covering the grime that came from hauling cargo through the mid-rim trade lanes for months at a time. Their leader was a woman named Rena, short and broad-shouldered with calloused hands and a laugh that could be heard from 3 corridors away. Her partner was a man named Dale, tall and quiet, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but always seemed to be listening. Drallo met them on his 4th day back on Port Callaway. He had returned from the council session with a new mission and no idea how to accomplish it. Asura had told him to eat with humans. The problem was that Drallo had no idea how to approach them. For the first 3 days, he had wandered the food court, watching from closer distances than before, but still unable to bring himself to sit at a human table. He was afraid, though he would not have admitted it was Rena who solved the problem. She walked up to his table on the 4th evening, dropped into the seat across from him, and asked him why he had been staring at people for a week straight. She was not angry. She was amused. Drallo panicked and told her a version of the truth. He said he was a researcher studying how different species eat. Rena grinned and said that if he wanted to study how humans eat, he should stop watching from the corner like a scared animal and come have dinner with her crew. Drallo accepted before his fear could talk him out of it. That evening, he followed Rena to a small common room in the lower levels of the station where the Dustrunner crew lived between cargo runs. The room was not much to look at. There were mismatched chairs, a battered metal table, and a cooking area in the corner that was cluttered with jars, bottles, and tools that Drallo did not recognize. Dale was already there, standing at the cooking area with his sleeves rolled up. He was doing something to a piece of meat. Drallo watched as Dale rubbed it with a mixture of ground minerals and dried plant matter, then placed it over a heating element that filled the room with a sharp, rich smell. Drallo's polyury senses were overwhelmed, but it was not unpleasant. It was complex, layered, like walking into a forest after rain. The rest of the crew arrived one by one over the next half hour. They greeted Drallo with casual nods and curious looks, but none of them made a fuss. Rena handed him a cup of something warm and told him it was tea, a drink made by soaking dried leaves in hot water. Drallo held it carefully. The heat was uncomfortable but tolerable. He took a small sip. It was bitter and earthy, and he felt a gentle warmth spread through his chest. When the food was ready, Dale set it in the center of the table. There was the cooked meat, sliced into strips. There were roasted roots, golden and soft. There was a bowl of green leaves dressed in a sharp-smelling liquid. And there was bread, a dense block of baked grain that Dale had apparently made himself that morning. The crew did not wait for a signal. They reached for the food with their hands and with tools, piling it onto their plates, passing bowls back and forth, arguing about who had taken too much bread. Rena put food on Drallo's plate before he could object. She gave him a small portion of the roasted roots and a piece of bread, telling him to start with those since she was not sure what his stomach could handle. Drallo ate slowly. The roots were soft and warm, with a sweetness he had never encountered in polyury food. The bread was dense and chewy, and it tasted like something old, something that had been made the same way for a very long time. As he ate, he listened. The crew talked about their last cargo run. They complained about station bureaucracy. They teased one of the younger crew members about a romantic interest on the station's upper level. Dale said almost nothing, but he refilled plates when they were empty and poured more tea when cups ran low. Rena held the table together with her voice, moving from one person to the next, checking in, laughing, steering conversations away from sore topics with a skill that Drallo recognized as leadership. After an hour, Drallo asked Dale about the spices he had used on the meat. Dale thought about it for a moment and then began to explain. He said the technique was called dry rubbing, and humans had been doing it for thousands of years. Long before humans had electricity or space travel, they had learned to preserve and flavor meat with salt, smoke, and dried herbs. It kept food safe during long winters when nothing grew. It made tough, dangerous meat edible. It turned survival into something that tasted good. Dale said his grandmother had taught him, and her grandmother had taught her. The recipe went back further than anyone in his family could remember. Drallo set down his fork and stared at the plate in front of him. For the first time, he began to understand what Asura had been trying to tell the council. This food was not the product of a predator's instinct. It was the product of 10,000 years of desperate survival on a world that tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. Every technique, every spice, every method of preparation was an answer to a problem that would have destroyed a weaker species. Humans did not eat like hunters because they enjoyed violence. They ate like hunters because on their world, anything less meant death. And somewhere along the way, they had turned that brutal necessity into something warm, something shared, something that felt like love. Drallo picked up his bread and took another bite. Across the table, Rena smiled at him and passed the roots. Rena had never been inside a Galactic Council chamber before. She had never been inside any government building more impressive than the licensing office on Port Callaway, where she renewed her freight permits every cycle. So when she stepped through the arched entrance of the council chamber on Station Adavar, she stopped walking and just looked up. The ceiling was over 100 meters high, shaped like the inside of a shell, with light panels embedded in curving rows that mimicked the patterns of a binary star system. The seats rose in tiers around a central floor, hundreds of them, each designed for a different species. Some were filled with water for aquatic delegates. Some were heated platforms for cold-blooded representatives. Some were just open spaces where gas-formed beings hovered in contained fields. Dale stepped up beside her and said nothing. He was carrying 2 large cases of cooking equipment. His face was calm, But Rena had been with him long enough to see the tension in his shoulders. Asura had arranged all of it. The old Meevely diplomat had contacted Drallo 2 weeks before the final council vote and told him that data alone would not be enough. The council needed to see. They needed to smell. They needed to experience what Drallo had experienced at that table in the lower levels of Port Callaway. And for that, they needed the humans who had shown Drallo the truth that Rena and Dale had been flown to Station Adavar on a Union diplomatic transport, given temporary ambassador status, and asked to do something that no human had ever been asked to do before. Cook for 72 species at the same time. Drallo was already at the center of the chamber when they arrived. He looked nervous. Bivin was beside him, mandibles clicking steadily. The chamber was filling up. Delegates filed into their species-specific seats, and a noise of dozens of alien languages being spoken at once filled the enormous space like the sound of an engine warming up. Delegate Moron of the Relevi was there. His motion to reclassify humans as apex predators was still on the table. Delegate Pulliner of the Gelvin was there too, her leaf-like arms folded tightly against her body. The anti-human coalition had grown in the weeks since the delay. Several new species had signed on, citing Drallo's original report as evidence. The mood in the chamber was not friendly. Asura took her seat in the upper tier and gave Drallo a small nod. Drallo stepped forward and began his presentation. He spoke for 20 minutes. He presented his original data, the chemical analyses, the behavioral comparisons, the jaw force measurements. He showed the council everything they had already seen. Then he stopped. He said that everything he had just presented was true. Human food behavior did match the patterns of apex predators. The data was undeniable, but data without context was dangerous. And the context had changed everything. He gestured toward Rena and Dale. Rena had set up a portable cooking station in the center of the chamber floor. Dale had arranged the ingredients beside her in neat rows. The two of them worked quickly, and within minutes, the smell began to spread through the enormous room. Rena grilled strips of seasoned meat over a small heat source. The fat sizzled and popped. She roasted vegetables beside them, turning them carefully with a metal tool. Dale squeezed fresh citrus over the top, and the sharp, bright scent cut through the heavier aromas like a blade. 3 delegations left the chamber. The Gelvin covered their breathing membranes. A Chelric representative in the 4th tier made a sound like a shriek. But most of the delegates stayed. They watched. Rena plated the food. She arranged it carefully. The meat in the center, the vegetables around it, a scatter of fresh herbs on top. It looked, even Drallo had to admit, beautiful. It looked like something made with care. Then she did the thing that Asura had coached her to do. The thing that would matter more than any data or any argument. She made a second plate. This one was different. She had spent 2 weeks working with Drallo, learning the polyury digestive system, understanding what compounds they could process, what textures they could tolerate, what flavors their limited taste receptors could detect. The second plate had no meat. It had soft, gently steamed plant matter. It had a mild sauce made from grain paste and a touch of natural sweetness. It had none of the aggressive chemicals or intense heat of a human version. It was designed, from the ground up, for Drallo. She carried it to him and set it down. The chamber was completely silent. Drallo looked at the plate. Then he looked at Rena. She smiled and told him to try it. He picked up his utensil and took a bite. The flavor was gentle and complex. Warm. There was a sweetness to it that reminded him of the nectar flowers from his homeworld. But there was something else beneath it, a richness that he had no word for in the polyury language. It was, without question, the best thing he had ever tasted. Rena turned to the council. She said she was not a scientist, and she was not a diplomat. She was a freight hauler who cooked for her crew. But she wanted them to understand one thing about humans and food. She said that on Earth, when you care about someone, you learn what they can eat. You change your recipes. You adjust your methods. You make something new so they can sit at your table and feel welcome. Feeding someone is not a display of power. It is the opposite. It is how humans say that you belong here, that you are one of us, that you are safe. The chamber remained silent for a long time after she finished speaking. The vote was not even close. Delegate Morin's motion to reclassify humans as apex predators was defeated by a margin of 59 to 13. The 13 votes in favor came from species that had already made up their minds long before Rena set foot in the chamber. The rest of the council, including several delegates who had previously supported the motion, voted against it. Delegate Poliner of the Gelvin was among them. She later told a Union journalist that she had changed her mind the moment the human woman made a second plate. Not for herself, not for her own kind, but for someone whose body could not handle what she normally ate. That, Poliner said, was not predator behavior. That was something else entirely. The council did not simply reject the reclassification. They created a new category. It had never existed before in Union taxonomy, because no species had ever required it. The official designation was adaptive apex nurturer. It meant a species that possessed the physical and behavioral traits of an apex predator, but had redirected those traits toward community building, caregiving, and interspecies cooperation. Humans were the first and only species to receive this classification. Dadralo's complete research paper was published 3 weeks later. It was 240 pages long and contained detailed analyses of over 300 human food items, 57 preparation techniques, and 12 cultural food rituals observed across different human populations on Port Callaway. The paper's title was simple. It was called Why They Eat Like This. Within a month, it became the most downloaded xenobiological study in the history of the Galactic Union Scientific Archive. The effects were immediate and far-reaching. Human food exports, which had previously been limited to a handful of bland, pre-approved items that passed Union safety standards, were reclassified under a new trade framework. Human spices, preserved meats, fermented products, baked goods, and prepared meals flooded galactic markets. Some species could not eat any of it. Others could only tolerate modified versions. But the demand was enormous because Drallo's paper had made human food the most talked-about subject in the Union. Human chefs became celebrities. Restaurants run by humans opened on stations across the mid-rim and inner territories. A Paul Urey food critic wrote a review of a human bakery on Station Adavar that became the most widely shared article in 3-star systems. The review described the experience of eating something called sourdough bread, a product made by cultivating wild bacteria in a flour mixture over several days and then baking it at high heat. The critic wrote that it tasted like patience. Rena and Dale returned to Port Callaway as minor legends. Their crew treated them exactly the same as before, which was exactly what Rena wanted. Dale went back to cooking in the small common room on the lower levels. The only difference was that now, sometimes, alien visitors would show up at their door, having heard about the freight hauler crew that had cooked their way into galactic history. Dale would look at them, say nothing for a moment, and then pull out an extra chair. Bivin resigned from the research project and took a position at a Union Cultural Exchange Center, where he ran a program that introduced Chelrick citizens to modified human foods. He never fully overcame his nervousness around human eating, but he developed a genuine fondness for a human drink called hot chocolate, which he consumed through a specially designed absorption tube. He said it made his thorax feel warm. Asra retired from the council 6 months after the vote. She gave a short farewell speech in which she said that in 30 years of diplomacy, the most important thing she had ever done was convince a scared Paul Urey scientist to sit down and eat bread with a freight hauler. She moved to a quiet colony world and spent her remaining years writing a memoir about her time on Earth. The book was called The Table, and its opening line read, "They set a place for me before they even knew my name." Drallo stayed on Port Callaway. He had been offered prestigious positions at 3 different Union research institutions, but he turned them all down. He said his work was not finished. He said he had studied human food for months, but he had only scratched the surface. There were thousands of human cultures, each with their own food traditions. There were dishes he had never heard of, techniques that went back further than human recorded history. He could spend the rest of his life studying it and never reach the end. But that was not the real reason he stayed. The real reason was a small restaurant that opened on the station's mid-level promenade 3 months after the council vote. Rena had opened it with money she had saved from 2 decades of freight hauling. It was a tiny place with 12 seats, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, and a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Everybody eats." Drallo went there every evening. He sat at the same seat by the window. And every evening, Rena brought him something new, a dish she had been working on, something adjusted for his Paul-Yuri biology, something gentle and warm and carefully made that on the evening that this story ends, Drallo was sitting in his usual spot when Rena set a plate in front of him. It was a small portion of something soft and golden, with a faint steam rising from its surface. He looked at it and then looked at her. She said she had been experimenting with a grain from her home region on Earth, ground and slow-cooked with a sweet syrup made from tree sap. She said on Earth, people ate it on cold mornings. She said it was what her mother used to make when Rena was small and the world outside was dark and freezing. She said the word for it was porridge. And she said it meant home. Drallo picked up a spoon, took a bite, and understood.